This is FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. This week, Jonathan Bennett and I talked to Mike Schwartz of Gluu about all kinds of things about identity that you didn't know, but is incredibly practical if you're in business, if you're just a user, whatever else it is. It's a real deep dive into how identity actually works on the internet when open source is involved. And that is coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 647, recorded Wednesday, September 15th, 2021. Gluu and open source digital ID. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Command Line Heroes, an original podcast from Red Hat that tells the epic true tales of developers, programmers, hackers, geeks, and open source rebels who are revolutionizing the technology landscape. Season 8 is out now. Search for Command Line Heroes on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Hello again. Good morning, good evening, good whenever it is, whenever and wherever you are. I am Doc Searls, and this is FLOSS Weekly. I am joined this week by Jonathan Bennett, who should come in for those watching video. There he is. Right there.
Hey, Doc. It is good to be here. It seems like it's been a long time since I've been on the show, and I get to do it this week and next week.
With you, it never seems like it's that long because you always seem to be around. It's great. And you're the one that got me to wear a sport coat. So I make sure
I'm
my
not sure
office
if I'm proud of that or...
No, you should be. It makes me look like I have shoulders and stuff like that. So I am now in Santa Barbara, California, in my actual office, where I think this will be the last time until December. And you're still in Oklahoma somewhere?
I am. Yeah, I'm here in the corporate headquarters, as I like to say, which is really the home office. But yeah, enjoying it. We're about to see the cool off, and it'll stop being 100 degrees outside every day. So a little bit better to be in Oklahoma. Yeah,
it is weird here because I'm in the subtropics, but it's cool every morning. There's actually marine fog outside right now. Not that you can tell, but just take my word for it. So our guest this week is Mike Schwartz, who's an old friend of mine. But I don't know. Are you familiar with what Mike is doing at all?
You know, I looked briefly to be prepared for the show, but other than that, no, I wasn't familiar with his work. Looks like some interesting stuff, though.
Yeah, he knows a lot and has done a lot. So I want to hurry to get to that. But first, I have to let y'all know that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Command Line Heroes, an original podcast from Red Hat. Command Line Heroes tells the epic true tales of developers, programmers, hackers, geeks, and open source rebels who are revolutionizing the technology landscape. Offers a unique blend of historical context and current trends shaping the tech landscape. This season tackles one question from every angle, and that is, what is a robot? A servant, a factory worker, a prosthetic, a vehicle? Why do we build robots that look like us? That's always an interesting thing to me. We always want one that looks like us. And we often ask whether we can trust robots or can robots trust us? So where do they go? Science fiction tells many stories about robots. In the future, they'll serve our every need, or maybe they'll develop a mind of their own, turn against us. Maybe they'll be the savior of humanity or our downfall. Maybe they'll do everything. We project all kinds of things on robots. Well, season 8 covers the robots that are in our midst and the determined dreamers who bring them to life. 8 episodes compare the promise of science fiction to the reality of robots today. I had the opportunity to listen to the first episode, Robot as Servant, and it was really interesting. Here's a clip.
While making this season, we discovered a robot reality that's pretty removed from the robots we imagine. And yet, all those misguided ideas about what a robot should be actually shaped what robots are. And no robot fiction shaped things more than the story we told ourselves about robotic servants.
Yeah, it's a great episode. It actually even features Nolan Bushnell of Atari fame. It's hosted by Suran Yitbarek and produced by Red Hat. It's a great show, so check it out. Season 8 is out now. Search for Command Line Heroes in Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to podcasts. We also include a link in the show notes. My thanks to Command Line Heroes for their support. So welcome, Mike, to the show. Mike's the founder of Gluu. That's Gluu, a software vendor in the digital identity and access management space, and much more, I happen to know. Gluu serves many large customers in finance, telco, government, higher ed, healthcare, consumer sectors. Last year, they announced the creation of the Janssen Project, chartered directly under the Linux Foundation to govern its core technology. Before Gluu, Mike was a consultant for many years. He's the author of the A-Press book, Securing the Perimeter, an intro to modern digital technology. He's based in Austin with his wife, 2 kids, dogs, cats, and a large family of white doves. Also white pigeons. So welcome, Mike. I didn't know about the doves somehow. I'm remembering when I got married, they had these white doves in a little cage as you went into the reception area, and somebody wrote in their guest book, "When do we eat the love doves?" So you're in Austin, I take it. It looks like
I think it's important, when you're sitting at the computer all day, to have some reason to get you outside. And, when I lived in New York, I love to fish. But when I moved here to Austin, it was a little bit further to the saltwater. And so I decided, racing pigeons would be fun. And it's more work than you think. And it's more challenging than you'd think to raise healthy birds. And so, animal husbandry is really rewarding and it's fun. And, they're pigeons if you see them on the street. They're doves if you release them from the wedding. And they're generally squab if you're eating them, but they're really all the same thing.
Rock doves, I think, is what they are in Europe, right? I mean, they're not, I don't think they're native to the U.S. I think they brought some over from cliffs in Italy or something like that.
Nobody knows where they're actually from. Sort of like chickens, and nobody knows where chickens are from. So they just sort of showed up, thousands of years ago when we started farming, and there was grain on the ground, and they were like, "Hey, that's dinner." And then we grabbed a couple and we domesticated them, and they've been with us for thousands of years, and they're native to nowhere.
There's a good friend of mine, Paolo Valdemar, he's Italian, and when I was visiting his house, he had a lot of cats, and he explained that cats came to Earth to domesticate the standing monkeys. So it may be a story like that. So yes. Before we get into it more, you also have your own podcast, and I've been on it, though I don't know if it's actually run, but I know I did one with you when you were starting out with it. So how's that going for you?
Yeah, so Doc was the first guest, and actually we were, it was the intro to the podcast, and it was before I knew how difficult it was to record. It was around 3 years ago when we did that at the European Identity Conference, right? And I left the window open, and then I realized how noisy it was outside, and I couldn't use most of the tape. But I actually got better and got real microphones, and so I've recorded about 55 episodes at this point, and I have to say it's been a great learning experience because I thought I knew a lot about open source software going into the project, but I learned something on every single interview, and I have a much more nuanced understanding of how to talk to business people about why open source makes sense. And I also have a much better understanding of the diversity of business models. If you read a blog or an article on the web about what are open source business models, you normally get a couple. But what I found was that business models is not just the monetization strategy, but it's more holistic. So it includes how do you interact with customers, what's your value proposition, what are the key resources for the organization, what are partnerships, monetization, of course, is important, but all of those things together form the business plan. And what I found, the reason I did the podcast is because as a founder of an open source company, I needed more information about, how to direct Gluu. and I felt like, well, I was doing that research. It would be nice to share that with other founders. And so we've had some really great guests, including Mark Shuttlesworth, the only guest who's been in space, the founder of Canonical, and the founder of, or the current CEO of SUSE, Melissa DiDonato, and really many other like great guests who have been generously volunteered their time and I highly recommend it. It's been great for me, but I think if you're thinking about starting an open source software company, then I would definitely recommend listening to it.
Mike, I want to come back and talk to you about that, about your business plan with Gluu. But before we get to that, can you give us kind of the 30,000 foot view of what the problem is that Gluu is solving? What space are you guys even working in?
Yeah. So we like to say Gluu is a digital identity platform. And what that means is people like to think of authentication as sort of what Gluu does, but it's really more than that, because authentication by itself is not necessarily that useful. So after we authenticate a person, we really need to know who is that person. So what's that person's first name, their last name, their email address, their role at the company. And so the Gluu platform is actually connects to ways to authenticate people, whether that's password or FIDO tokens or biometric. And we see that as content. But fundamentally, the Gluu server is an API that applications like websites and mobile apps can call, which performs the authentication, but also shares attributes or user claims about the person. And this is a critical requirement for businesses. Almost every business out there has a website or mobile app today, and so we've come a long ways from war games where I think it was pencil was the password, and you logged in with your username and your password. So how we actually remotely authenticate people has really become a multi-step workflow where we look at lots of information and contextual information and determine what's the risk of fraud. And also we need to establish trust with the applications themselves. Who are these websites that are requesting this authentication? How much do we trust them? If we release information about them, how do we trust them to protect that information? So all of that stuff together is really what we're calling digital identity, and it's built on top of a number of standards that enable interoperability across a broad range of applications. Does that help?
It does. I have a lot of follow-up questions. This is a topic that is surprisingly difficult to get right. I do a security column over at Hackaday.com every week, and a large portion of the things that we cover is essentially different companies that have gotten this wrong. One of the things that we see a lot is where a company gets broken into in one way or another, their database leaks, and they have all of these hashed passwords that are oftentimes not hashed very well. And so, it's possible to recover passwords or connect people's accounts in different ways. I'm curious, do you guys solve that problem for businesses then? If they use the Gluu server, they don't have to roll their own, encryption, not encryption, but their own sign-in process, their own password hashing. All of that comes for free if you use Gluu. Is that right?
Well, so Gluu has so that's authentication, right? When you present a username and password, you're proving something that you know, and so the old school definition of authentication is something you know, something you are, something you have, and two factors when you combine two of those. So Gluu's strategy is to provide some built-in mechanisms. For example, password authentication, OTP authentication, if you've ever used Google Authenticator to put in the little code, the little numeric code, or FIDO authentication, which is if you've seen YubiKeys or other platform authenticators like the Touch ID, those are FIDO, follow the FIDO standard. So Gluu tries to build in for free authentication mechanisms that are based on open standards, but we also support third-party authentication mechanisms. So there's been a huge burst of creativity in passwordless authentication. So Gluu supports platforms like Stitch and Hyper and Duo and BioID. And so there's a whole. So in the Gluu server, you can say, how do you want to authenticate this person? And you can define a multi-step workflow. What that means is that we can display one or more web pages. In the old days, we might just display one web page where you put in your username and password. But today, we might look at the risk and do what's called adaptive authentication, where we say, okay, we validated the password, but however, this location of the IP address looks a little weird. Maybe we're going to give you a second web page where we're going to ask you to enter your OTP or your FIDO token or send you an SMS. So the process of authentication today, you really need to think of it more like a workflow, where you're going to add more steps to that workflow based upon the perceived risk of the authentication and the value of the transaction and the system that you're protecting. And this is, you're right that the largest number of breaches result in over or bad authentication or failed authentication. And so I had an old boss years ago, and he said the biggest bang for your buck you can get in security is two-factor authentication, meaning that this is really one of the best investments you can make. And I always say, I wonder why companies spend so much money on fraud detection and not enough money on fraud prevention. And could really think about more deeply.
Yeah. So there's something else that we see a lot of different services using, and that's the idea of sign in with my Facebook account, Google account, Microsoft account, all these different things that you can use to authenticate. I'm curious, is that an option that Gluu supports as well? If someone wants to come to my services but use Google for authentication, does that work?
Yeah, so generically we call that inbound authentication at Gluu, where there's some external identity provider, be it Google or Twitter or Facebook or GitHub or even some corporate SAML identity provider, and you want to configure the Gluu server to trust that authentication source. And I have a friend at Adobe who used to say that social login was a way to trick somebody to register. Because you use your Google login at let's say a website, and then they create an account for you at that website, and that account is linked to your Google account. And I don't think anyone's actually really tricked by this. I think they understand what's going on. But actually, from Gluu's perspective, we see that social accounts or external accounts are another really authentication mechanism. You could think about it. You could use your password, or you could prove you have control of an external account, like a certain Gmail account that you've associated with your account at that domain. So I do think that, we're in a world where everyone probably dreamed maybe 20 years ago that we'd have one authentication account to sort of rule them all. But I think today's world is really, the reality is that people have a lot of social accounts. They have corporate accounts. They have different types of authenticators. And so one of the challenges we see at a lot of organizations is it's not that two-factor authentication or this problem is unsolvable, but it's not that there's no technology to do it. It's not that there's no desire to improve the usability, because the usability of putting in your password on your phone is terrible, but a lot of the challenges around deployment. And so we think that sort of one of the main barriers to sort of wider adoption of better authentication practices is how do you tie all these things together as a company? And how do you do this at scale if you have of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees or millions of consumers? How do you deploy sort of this advanced identity platform and drive down the operating costs over time, which ends up really being significant.
You talked about this idea of social login. There was a service that I actually really enjoyed up until they got acquired, and that was Keybase. And one of the interesting things that Keybase had you do is you would go to your various services like GitHub, Twitter, I think Reddit as well were some of the places, and you would post a cryptographic token that would say, I am this person. And it was all about establishing trust that the person that I am on Keybase is actually the same person that you know from GitHub and Twitter and Reddit and all these other different places. And I always thought that was a really interesting idea. And I don't know, that's probably out of scope for Gluu, although someone could probably, well, you could, obviously the one to tell us, but someone could probably use Gluu to build a service like that, right?
So one of the great things about authentication is that there's been a lot of innovation. And so our take on at Gluu is that we want to support, we want to provide some sort of built-in features, but also provide a standard extension mechanism so that as these new technologies evolve, you can easily connect them and integrate them into the Gluu server. This is why I said we sort of see authentication technology as content, and why we're always trying to add support for new vendors like Stitch and Hyper are pretty new, relatively new as things go. But we see that there's so much advancement in biometric authentication and also FIDO. More and more platforms, like the MacBook Air that I'm using, has a FIDO Touch ID on the keyboard. But what we're seeing is that there's so much innovation in authentication technology that it's important for the identity platform to be able to support these great new technologies as they evolve.
So we actually have a question from our chat room. One of the chatters asks, how safe is the system itself? How likely is it for bad actors to inject Gluu with malware that would authenticate credentials that do not exist?
So it depends how good of a job you do deploying Gluu. Because a lot of security is about operating process and procedure. And so Gluu is not a SaaS service. Gluu is an open source software project that can be used for both high and low value transactions. So Gluu is used by community clubs, and it's used by governments. And it's used by finance companies and consumer companies. And really, the amount of care you spend in deploying it and also in designing the identity management processes behind the Gluu server impact greatly the security. Remember, it's garbage in, garbage out. So Gluu could be the most secure server in the world, but if you do email-based password recovery and a hacker breaks into your email, which is not that unlikely given the number of phishing attacks that are out there, and they can reset your password on the Gluu server, then it's the process of that recovery that will undermine the integrity of the system. And so different organizations have different processes and different policies that really impact ultimately the security of an individual Gluu installation.
Excellent. So I'm curious, when someone wants to deploy Gluu, what is it that they get? Is this a full operating system, or is this just another service that someone installs on their server? What does that side of it look like?
Yeah. So when I was a consultant for 10 years and I worked in the enterprise access management space, it used to take us a week to deploy this stuff, like sometimes more. And it was really difficult. So when we started Gluu, we wanted to make it relatively easy. So we built Linux packages. So you could do something like apt install Gluu server, add our GPG key, to verify the package, apt install Gluu server, and then you run setup, you answer a couple of questions, and it's installed on your system, and you can log into the admin interface. So one of our goals at Gluu was Gluu is actually a bunch of systems working together, like your email system, people think of email as like one thing, but email is actually like the outbound server, the inbound server, the interface, the web interface you might use, spam, detection, virus scanning. So it's all these things working together. And a modern identity platform is very similar. It includes, at a minimum, an internet-facing web tier that's rendering the login page, but also a database of some type and an admin interface of some type. So Gluu as a platform, what we wanted to do was to make this platform easy to install. So you weren't following like 10 pages of instructions of how to set up the data and get everything connected. So it's easy to deploy, but it is a number of systems working together. We've also extended that into the cloud native world, which is more challenging than it might sound. But so to maintain the sort of ease of use, where in the container world, where each service is running in its own container and there's orchestration and you're spooling up and down services on the fly, based on, to auto scale based on demand, took a lot of work. And it's not just containerizing these components, but also sort of building this whole layer of infrastructure around it to sort of maintain the ease of use of the platform.
Yeah, some companies and some people, they take their service and they install it in the Docker image and they ship that. No, it's done. We finished it. No, there's a little more to it than that.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Well, I was going to say that.
Follow up on that if you want to.
Yeah. So we love Kubernetes, but we also realize that Kubernetes is difficult. And so with Kubernetes, you get auto scaling and zero downtime updates and a lot of benefits that were critical for our customers. But we do realize that it's an operational skill that not every organization has right now, and so I think we're in sort of a transitional period where we're moving from the VM world to the cloud native world, but we are very excited about this, and we do think that this is the way of the future.
And so it sounds like the way you guys distribute this for the most part is you run your own repositories. I'm curious, what distros do you support? Debian, Ubuntu, the RHEL derivatives, and then there's as many distros as you want to name are out there. How many of those do you guys have packages for?
Right. Currently, CentOS, Red Hat, Ubuntu, Debian. However, in Gluu 4.3, which is coming out like literally this week, we're dropping Debian. And we're going to add SUSE. SUSE is now the world's largest independent open source company, and we think it's time. They're doing great work. It's RPM based, so we're adding SUSE to the list. We're dropping Debian. We have Ubuntu, and we saw less demand in the enterprise space for Debian, and so we're going to support SUSE Enterprise Linux.
It's interesting. A lot of people, when the kerfluffle with CentOS happened a few months ago, it seems like SUSE has picked up some of those refugees, I suppose we could say, and it seems to be very interesting. Although, of course, there's a couple of people trying to pick the pieces up and be the next CentOS. So it's interesting that you guys support all of those. If someone really wanted to, you could probably take the .deb that's designed for Ubuntu and take it back and run it on Debian, couldn't you?
Yeah, I would think so.
But of course, if you're at that point where you're willing to do that much work, it's probably just easier to use the cloud native. You want to dive a little bit more into what exactly cloud native means and how that's different from a VM and kind of what that means to you guys?
Yeah. So, operating cost is the biggest driver of expense. The Gluu server tends to be in production for years, and a lot of systems hang off of it. And upgrade is painful because when you test all your apps connected to the identity platform, it has a big impact. So we've been super focused on lowering the operating costs of the platform for a long time. And we saw some huge advantages for cloud native because this really started years and years ago. We were working with Toshiba on a TV. Their TVs were using our service. You might know you log into your TV these days. So we had a TV project with Toshiba, and they asked us, like, how many servers do we need? And as the vendor, we gave them like this huge, we calculated their peak load, for like when, the football game is happening and when they would, have the most load. And we gave them the price. We told them what servers we wanted them to run. And they said, this is going to cost us a fortune to run it all the time. And we thought about it and we're like, you know what? Those servers are going to be doing nothing most of the time. So auto scaling was really important to us cloud is great, but cloud is also expensive. And the way to really use cloud effectively requires that you can scale up and down the infrastructure on demand. And for us, Kubernetes was the only way to do that. So ultimately, the move to cloud native to us was about reducing operating cost. But when we say cloud native, what we also mean is that configuration as code. So we're trying to automate provisioning or automate deployment so that you can't spool up a VM in a couple of seconds. Like, no matter how quick you think you can do it, it's going to take time. So for cloud native, everything has to be automated. Configuration has to be centralized. So that to me, that's a big part of it. And the other important thing for us has been around persistence. When we started Gluu in 2009, almost all of the identity platforms were using LDAP. LDAP was tried and true as a backend for single sign-on systems and access management systems. However, what we found is that actually a lot of the work in deploying a mission-critical identity platform is in the persistence layer. And one of the ways you can drive down the operating cost is to use more cloud services. So one of the tenets of cloud native is use services where they're available. And we felt that supporting cloud native databases would reduce the operational expense for our customers. So one of our goals in the cloud native distribution has been to offer alternatives like Amazon Aurora and Google Spanner as persistence options for the Gluu server, not just LDAP. So there are some great books on cloud native, and I'm not going to proclaim to be a cloud native expert, but sort of my take on it is configuration as code, use cloud services where possible, and support auto scaling and move to containerization, that kind of thing.
Well, I have some questions that have piled up while Jonathan has held the floor very well. This is a great show so far, and we're going to keep it that way. But I want to let everybody know it's even greater if you also belong to Club TWiT. Club TWiT is our subscription service. You get TWiT on-demand podcasts ad-free. There's a TWiT Plus bonus feed of stuff that you don't necessarily see on the regular free podcast. And there's a members-only Discord, and I want to point to that for a second because actually there is a side conversation going on there right now about pigeons. So these things can go sideways in an actually constructive way. So it's only $7 a month. You get all our shows ad-free. Again, the TWiT Plus bonus feed. The members only Discord. So join today. It's at twit.tv/clubtwit. So make it knowing you as long as I have, what's interesting to me, especially interesting, is how much you're working kind of on the ground. I mean, you've got a relatively small business. It's not tiny, but it's a serious business. And you're with lots of different kinds of businesses, but identity has changed so much. And I'm remembering at IW, OAuth was very heavily discussed. I think in many ways, the OAuth protocol, is it a protocol or is it just a format? I forget which, but OAuth is what we now call social login. But that wasn't the original idea. The original idea was just how do you make it easier for users to log into things? But then it became log in with Facebook and log in with Twitter and log in with Google and the rest of them. So there are so many projects like this that start with one ambition and kind of go sideways into another. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that and how you kind of navigate that as it comes along.
Yeah, so, the original mission of Gluu was to start a platform for digital identity based on open source software that would provide more innovation than what was available in the market. So I had been an enterprise IT professional, and I was frustrated with the rate of innovation of some of the commercial products out there, where they were always saying, like, we'll have this feature next quarter, and next quarter became next quarter, and next quarter became next year. And I started to think there has to be why is there no open source one of these identity platforms? And that's really been the mission since day one. And however, you're right, the market has changed a lot in the last 12 years since we started. So this is a market that's driven by standards, because you can't top down say every application is going to use this protocol. Well, tell that to Salesforce. They have their own opinion about technology stack. So the standards have driven the identity space because there's so many different types of applications. We have custom applications, off-the-shelf applications, cloud applications, mobile applications, single-page applications. So there's so much diversity. We need these standards in order to get single sign-on and interoperability across all of them. And so, but yeah, this has been a very challenging market because, when I started Gluu in 2009, the market was vastly different than it is today. And some of that change has been driven by standards. As you mentioned, OAuth has really done great work for us in addressing some of the new challenges that we have around security and mitigating lots of risks that were previously difficult to mitigate. So the work around OAuth and OpenID has been great. There's also been changes to the market. So Okta started in 2009. So when we started Gluu in 2009, the idea of cloud computing was new, and of course that was a major shift in the in how enterprises want to build their IT staffs and consume software. So Gluu has had to adapt in a number of ways, but we have sort of stayed true to the mission, which is to build the world's best identity platform based on open source software. Does that make sense?
It does. So one of the things that I want is my own identity platform. And that is one reason why something you haven't mentioned yet and may not want to mention for all I know, because maybe it doesn't work, is SSI, self-sovereign identity, which has been a huge topic at IW. And I gave 2 talks already at the European Identity Conference in Munich that I'm not at, but I did it remotely. Because the idea behind SSI is that I have my own portfolio of identifiers and that I disclose what all these different platforms that you're working on the enterprise side can hear about, get authenticated or verified, but I don't have to. I have what Kim Cameron, formerly of Microsoft, called minimum disclosure for constrained use and justifiable operators, plurality of operators. But I'm wondering, I've seen very little development. I do. There's some, and hats off to where it's happened on my side, on the user's side, on the individual side. That gives me the wallet of identifiers that I would need in order to make SSI happen. So I'm wondering if I could get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so this has been a topic that's near and dear to the hearts of all in the identity space, is how do we control our own information, and why do I have to rely on somebody else to provide that information to the applications that I want to share this information with? And I think, ultimately we need both. And Gluu we see Gluu as a way to be a conduit between self-sovereign identity claims and applications, because ultimately, if you're going to a website or you're using a mobile application, that application needs some API to call to get that information. And that API very conveniently might be OAuth or OpenID. And the OpenID provider on the back end might need to connect to a blockchain to collect self-sovereign claims. Remember, I originally said Glue's not just about authentication. It's about sharing information about people like first name and last name and email. And self-sovereign claims could be also part of these claims that are released. So we see self-sovereign identity at Gluu as an adjacent market, and we're really excited about the work that's going on to enable people to use these technologies. But ultimately, when you mentioned we're a relatively small team, we're like 50 people, and when you're a small company, you have to focus on being the best at one thing. And so ultimately, we think we already have a big product surface area in building this digital identity platform. So we see self-sovereign as something that so the next bunch of geniuses will have to solve this one. But at 51 years old, I'm too old to solve that one. And so I hope the 20-somethings out there figure out how to solve it. And then Gluu will connect to that self-sovereign identity platform that they build.
It's like you're 50 or 51. I wish I was still 50 or 51. That's the age of the 3 of our kids are in that range. And the funny thing is that pretty much everything I'm known for, I've done since I was 50. So it's a funny thing. I want to ask about XDI. And the reason I want to ask an XRI, which are kind of like in the same family, because you and I in the past, and there was a lot of fantasy about how great that was going to be. It's one of those many protocols or formats or other ideas that come along, 3-letter acronyms that were going to be the thing that changes the world and helps us out. I remember being in your office, you had this wonderful plaque on the wall that was a diagram of how XDI actually worked. There were little pieces of rice or something embedded in the varnish, and you did a better job than anybody, I think, of explaining what that was. And yet adoption ended up being roughly 0, and it's still laying around. I just looked on Wikipedia; it's still there. So you've had a lot of experience with protocols and other things that kind of come and go. You mentioned earlier, okay, we drop Debian, we pick up SUSE. They're, in the vast petri dish of all the possible protocols, all the possible distros of Linux and the rest of it. Some colors dominated sometimes, and then they shrink, and people come and go, and somebody comes along with a great idea that's better, and then adoption may depend on all kinds of things. Are there APIs for this or not? If they're not, well, that doesn't happen, right? So how do you stay on top of that? And give me your postmortem if there is one on XDI.
Yeah. So, one of my sort of business rules of thumb is don't throw good money after bad. And so if you buy a stock at, 50 and it goes to 20, don't hang in there. If you don't think that's the best investment today, sell it, take and buy something else that's going to grow faster. And so when you're doing a startup, you have to make some bets because you have to do the next thing. Like the thing that people are already doing, it's too late to do that. So you have to make some tactical bets on what's going to be the next big thing. And at Gluu, we made a couple of bets, and some of them worked out and some of them didn't. And what's important is that if you bet on something that doesn't work out, that even if you made a big investment in it, you pull the plug and you right the ship and you put the rest of your money in the thing that's working. Ultimately adoption is more important than standards. So there's 2 types of standards out there. There's a build it and they will come standard, like Field of Dreams. And there's a everyone's using this, let's standardize it. So JSON's a good example. It wasn't a standard until everyone started using it. And XDI was a build it and they will come standard, but they didn't come. And so ultimately, your job as a founder is to solve a business problem in a unique way for customers. And if that's not happening, then move on. Why it didn't happen? I think that, as you know, Doc, you're an expert in identity. The identity field is littered with lots of like standards that didn't work out. I think more than in any other market.
There are many smoking corpses by the side of the road. For sure.
Hey, I want to jump in if I can, Mike, and ask you something. We haven't covered this yet. What about the integration with websites and other services? How does that part work? What languages do you support? So, if someone is building a website using Python and Flask, is there a Python plugin for this? Node.js, there's a whole bunch of options here. I'm just curious, what does that side of it look like? How difficult is it to build a service that talks to Gluu?
Right. So this is the key question that actually drives the cost of the integration for most companies. And the answer from Gluu is always use standards. So the two most important standards here are OpenID and SAML. And you'll find that there's OpenID and SAML libraries for everything. There's many Python libraries for OpenID, and there's many SAML libraries for all this. So we'd say if you're writing a new application, use the new standard, right? OpenID is OAuth and RESTful service. OpenID is JSON and RESTful services. So it's more developer friendly. It's more modern. However, if you have an application that already supports SAML and all you have to do is put in the SAML IDP, information, then go ahead and do it. That's okay too. But the key for this is that application developers should never hard code authentication business logic. And that means they should never be sending the username and password to the database and verifying it. But it also means that they should not be calling third-party authentication services. That's no better than validating the password yourself. Application developers should use open standards like OpenID, and that way, if the organization decides that there's a new, better authentication technology out there, they can switch to it without the application developers having to recode the application business or the authentication business logic. So the quick answer to your question is stick with open standards, and there's really good OpenID libraries out there. And the OpenID Foundation certifications, which you referenced, actually even shows that there's a RP certification. So RP is relying party. So that would be like your website or mobile app that's calling something like the Gluu server. The Gluu server is called the OpenID provider, or i.e. the IDP. And the RP or relying party is relying on the Gluu server to do that authentication. The other great thing about this is that Gluu looks no different than Google or Azure AD. And the way that we sort of drive down the cost for application developers is by using sort of the tried and true mechanisms that they already know. So if you go to your developers and you're going to call the Gluu server just like you call Google, except use this DNS name and not Google's DNS name, then they already have the tools in their toolkit. They probably already have done a job where they connected to Google. And so one of the keys here is to be sort of developer friendly and use the tools and the libraries that they're already used to using.
So let me ask. I think the same thing. In fact, I think you just answered this, but let me put the point on it by asking this question. When you guys built Gluu, did you build your own API that these websites will connect to, or is it totally based on OpenID?
It's totally based on OpenID. Yeah, we really did not want a proprietary API. The problem with proprietary APIs is that you get locked in. So in the last generation of web access management tools, switching costs were really high. If you wanted to move off of CA SiteMinder or you wanted to move off of Oracle Access Manager, well, there was a proprietary plugin and proprietary protocol between the application and the server, and that made switching costs really, really high. So one of our founding tenets was that we would only use open standards. So there's no proprietary API. Now we have a configuration API that, of course, is specific to our server, but that's just for how do you configure it. But from the application, developer, how am I going to integrate digital identity, the centralized digital identity service? We're sticking with open standards. So the documentation for the Gluu API is OpenID Core 1.0.
It's interesting to me with OpenID because the Internet Identity Workshop, IIW, started in 2005, and it actually came out of a conversation at a podcast at Dan Gilmour's, Steve Gilmour's podcast. But the interesting thing is that the very first one, Brad Fitzpatrick showed up. He had LiveJournal. I think he just sold LiveJournal. And to Six Apart, a company called Six Apart, and he said, "Hey, I have this thing called OpenID. You guys want to take it and run with it because I'm not using it and it's interesting." And it, but I wasn't aware of when it took off or how it took off, except that it was this conversation at every IW for a number of years, and I actually thought, well, we're still talking about this. Is it going to go anywhere? And now it's gigantic. And I wonder if these things just happen kind of in the quiet when nobody's looking, or it's just being applied for people like you who have a business that needs to apply this thing. But it's interesting to me how far it's gone. I hadn't even realized how gigantic it is at this point.
Yeah, so remember, the OpenID Foundation is effectively controlled by Microsoft and Google. Sure, there are other participants, but they have huge economies of scale, right? And so for them to pivot left or right is a huge economic impact. And so to their credit, they made huge technical contributions here. Google shared how they're authenticating people, and they shared the experience of how do we help developers and make it developer friendly, and all this user feedback. So the value that they've added was tremendous. And maybe one of the trade-offs is that they wanted a certain amount of control of that because it would have a big impact on their business. So the technology is really solid. In 2009, it became clear that XML wasn't going to be the way forward. And so everyone thought SAML was great, but in 2009, we realized that due to XML canonicalization and how difficult it is to parse XML, there were a lot of XML parser errors that led to security problems, that XML was just not the way, and some simpler data serialization format was needed, and JSON was an obvious choice. So to a large extent, what OpenID is SAML in JSON REST. And it took a long time to build everything that SAML had in this new sort of format, and also with all of the risk mitigations that have been gathered by Google and Microsoft. There were hundreds of thousands of hacks against these systems a week. So there was a lot of experience. Not only was it a rebuild of SAML, but it was also basically the incorporation of all of these mitigations of risk and these different types of applications that now existed. When SAML was designed, it was all web applications, but now we had, in 2007, the iPhone came out after SAML was complete, and we had this whole other risk surface area, plus single-page application, JavaScript applications happened after SAML. So that's why originally there was a lot of some initial pushback because OAuth 1 was an authentication protocol, and in a way, OAuth 2 was a nothing protocol. And however, and the feedback was it's going to take years for us to develop all of this enterprise authentication stuff that they're asking for around OAuth. And in fact, it did take years. It took 4 or 5 years to build all that stuff. But at this point, they did all that. Plus, they've continued to innovate into new areas. So OpenID has been phenomenally successful. It's definitely the best bet of all the bets we made at Gluu on different technologies. Our bet on OpenID has really been one of the best. The community has done a great job developing it, and we're grateful to them for that. And it's continued to innovate and really become the sort of undisputed digital identity standard today.
Mike, we are almost out of time, but Retcon5 from our chat room has asked a really interesting question. So if you have we have just a minute to briefly touch on this. Can you compare and contrast with Okta, OKTA, the Okta platform, and how that is different? What sets Gluu apart?
Right. So there's really a big fork in the market here. So Okta is a hosted identity platform, and Gluu is open source software that allows you to deploy your own Okta. So, the Okta is a phenomenal service, and most mid-sized companies don't want to deploy the Gluu server. They don't want to operate this stuff anymore. Let somebody else do it. Let Okta do it. Let Okta do backup and monitoring and upgrades and all that stuff and all the care and feeding that goes along with it. So Gluu is software that you use to deploy and host your own identity software, your own identity platform. With that said, we are launching Gluu Cloud and Gluu Solo, which are two different cloud offerings. Gluu Solo is targeted at the mid-tier, which will be a single tenant service that'll give people more flexibility than they would get at an Okta, which is a multi-tenant SaaS service. So that means your data is mixed in with everyone else's. So Gluu Solo is a single tenant platform, which will give you some more control over where you want to host that information in what country, and also customizations that might not be possible in a platform like Okta. And Gluu Cloud is our either self-hosted or Gluu-hosted sort of hyperscale platform for mostly consumer-facing applications. So we are going also in the direction of offering a cloud. But to answer the question, Okta today is a multi-tenant SaaS-hosted identity platform, and Gluu is software that you would deploy and operate in your own data center on your own cloud to provide similar services to what Okta is doing today.
Mike, we are absolutely at the end of our time, but we've got a set of ending questions that we ask everybody. Just really, really briefly. First off, what are your thoughts on blockchain? Do you have any, let's see, how's the way I normally ask this? Does this project use blockchain in any way?
I would say that we connect to blockchain infrastructure, and we see blockchain as a great way to empower, as Doc mentioned, self-sovereign identity, and that it's going to be an important source of user claims, and it's going to be important to find a conduit for how do we share those blockchain-based claims with applications like websites and mobile apps. So I'd say we're sort of adjacent to blockchain.
Perfect. And then when you sit down to do some actual programming yourself, what is your favorite text editor and scripting language?
So definitely Python is my favorite scripting languages. There's no question about that. I actually, if most of the time I'm going to use VI, but if I'm programming these days, I'm using Atom. I really like Atom. So I highly recommend it to everyone. Also for Markdown, Atom is great. Control-Shift-M and it gives you the viewer. It's my tip for the day.
Well, there you go. We got a freebie at the end. All right. Doc is having just a few technical difficulties, so I get to wrap the show up. But Mike, we appreciate you being here so much. It was an excellent show, and glad you got to come and talk about Gluu, which I think I'm going to have to go set an instance up just to play with because it looks really cool.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, Doc, wherever you are.
All right. Well, that has been Mike from the Gluu server. And again, just an excellent conversation with him. And we want to let you know that we've got a special show next week. They left me in charge, or they're going to. Doc has a scheduling conflict, but I'll be here and we'll be talking to someone very interesting. I don't have the document pulled up at the moment. And then before we let you go, I do want to let you know about a couple of things. First off, I run a column over at hackaday.com. Every Friday morning, it goes live. We talk about this week in security, the different things going on. And we might even talk about Gluu over there, just because whenever I find a really interesting project, I'll plug it there. And then the other thing is you really need to be on TWiT Plus, because we do every week on Saturday afternoon a Linux show, the Untitled Linux Show. And we're still trying to figure out what we want that show to be when it grows up. But man, for the meantime, we really have a blast doing it. You can get on the Discord with us. And if you really want to, you can even be one of the co-hosts. We're always looking for people to come up and share their opinions on stuff. So that is a blast. But all of that, definitely worth looking at. But until then, we will see you next time on FLOSS Weekly.
So you got yourself the brand new latest and greatest iPhone or Samsung smartphone because you heard about all of the beautiful photography those things can create. But for some reason, you're just not quite getting it done when you try to make your photos. Or you got yourself a brand new camera because you were interested in getting started in photography, but your little new inexpensive camera still isn't quite cutting it. Well, you need to check out my show, Hands-on Photography, here on TWiT. I'm going to show you how to be a better photographer and a better post-processor, and quite frankly, just help you get the most out of that new camera that's either on your phone or the brand new one that you just got for your birthday or gifts or what have you. And it's going to be a lot of fun. So head on over to twit.tv/hop. That's twit.tv/HOP and subscribe today.